The Witcher franchise is a story world that has multiple factions with strong goals and motivations. Many of the Witcher stories are set with a backdrop of war, where the Nilfgaardian Empire is attacking the northern kingdoms. The Emperor of Nilfgaard, Emhyr Emrys, is also desperately searching for Ciri, a princess of Sintra. Through a series of events, Geralt of Rivia, the central character and titular Witcher, becomes destiny bound to Ciri and takes up the mantle of protecting her. You also have many other factions playing roles in the story and crossing over with one another, like the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, whom work with the Northern Kingdoms to defend against Nilfgaard's invasions. Some of them also take an interest in Ciri, as Geralt is known to have dalliances with different sorceresses throughout the series. Some wish to protect her, while others seek to use her and her powers. Then you also have factions like the Squirrel Tail, a group of guerrilla demi-humans that side with Nilfgaard in the war against the Northern Kingdoms, for they have long felt oppressed living in the Northern Kingdoms as non-humans. There are many more plots and factions in the world of The Witcher, but Andrzej Sapkowski gives us a taste of how building strong factions is imperative for making dynamic worlds. Good factions make your world feel lived in. They provide allies and enemies for your player characters to interact with, side with, fight against, or betray. Hi, welcome to Earthmote. I'm Randall. Today we are talking all about factions, how to design them for tabletop role-playing games. So let's go ahead and get into it. A faction is basically designed like an NPC. On the most simplest level, all you really need to know about it is its goals and motivations. Beyond that, you can start to add basic characteristics that help describe it like you would a non-player character, an NPC. Even if your players aren't actively dealing with your faction, the faction can still be a major part of your sandbox. You can spread rumors or news of the faction and what it's up to in your sandbox as the players interact with the world. Perhaps they get rumors from a barkeep and they learn about what a faction is doing. You can also supply clues and other information that links groups that your players are interacting with ones that they've yet to deal with. So perhaps your players raid a bandit's hideout only to find a ledger that links them to a local baron. Beyond giving your organization its main goals and ambitions, according to the Angry Game Master, there are three main things you can add to a faction to give it more depth within your game world. You can add history to it, you can develop relations with other factions, and you can add members to the faction. History is pretty straightforward. This is just the context of your faction, who they are, why they exist, how we've gotten to this point right now that you're playing in your sandbox. When it comes to history, less is probably more. Add enough to fill out the intrigue of your faction, but listing the 37 different guild masters that have led the faction over the years is probably going to add very little value to your game. Keep it bare bones, and as your players interact with it and you think about your world and develop it more, you can add more to it. But for the beginning, history, just give yourself a basic structure and go from there. I like to focus on the history that is relevant to the current situation of the sandbox. So why do these factions like or dislike one another? What context is important for the conflicts that the faction finds itself in? How did the faction accumulate the resources it currently has? Why is the faction operating in the locations that they currently are? For you as a game master, you might want to list out the history and create different aspects of the lore. That's great, but just remember when you are presenting it within the game to your players, history is best presented through things that your players can interact with in the game rather than doing a lore dump on them. Let them find a waylaid merchant's guild caravan alongside the road, only to find traces of illicit goods being transported by that guild. or let them find a magical shield inscribed with the oath of a nearby order of knights to learn more about their tenets. Those are the sort of things that can intrigue your players without glazing their eyes over with too much history. You are far better off offering teasers and trailers of information than putting your players to sleep with a lore dump. If your players want to learn more about a faction, let them roleplay within the world. Have them ask around in local villages or connect with sages that might know a deeper history about the faction. Essentially, let them make the choice for lore dumps rather than you just thrusting it upon them. Developing relationships with other factions is probably the most important piece you can add to create more depth for any faction within your sandbox game. This is how you make your world feel dynamic and alive. When your players start to see the different groups that like or dislike one another, they can start to get their bearing on how they can operate within the game world. And then once they understand that, they can get to make decisions on who they like and who they want to work with. They have information available to them, and that can come by secondhand accounts or first-hand interactions. For example, everyone knows that the Church of the War God is trying to stamp out the cult of the rampaging demon lord. So how do we do it? Well, you can start by creating a thing called a faction web diagram to make sure that your factions have sufficient interaction with one another. If you took my advice and came up with 3 to 6 conflicts, then you can start to create factions that will fit in nicely with those conflicts and putting them on opposing sides of one another. If you have factions but haven't come up with any conflicts yet, well, then you can look at the goals of your factions and see how those goals and motivations could compete with one another. Then start making the connections between your factions and see how the conflicts are drawn between them based off of that. You can also have some factions that are not in conflict with one another, but rather in support of one another. I'd say you probably need fewer of these. If there are obvious natural alliances between your factions, build them up and make them visible within your world, but otherwise having your factions be neutral to one another is perfectly okay. They can still come into contact with one another as your campaign plays out, and that might change their relationships between one another. The third piece you can add is faction membership. While a faction is an important part of your game, those actions of the faction are played out through its organization's members. People are what do things. For example, Inquisitor Jack is the one that burns the witch at the stake, even if it's the Red Hand of God that is responsible for the choice to start the witch hunt in the first place. For each faction you create, you'll want to identify a few members to start. Probably only need 3 or 4, maybe even less. But you'll want to focus on the ones that have authority or unique positioning within the faction. These are characters that will likely be involved in the faction's conflicts and be the ones that can make decisions around it. Inquisitor Jack may not be the head of the church, but he's been granted authority to hunt down the witches and put them on trial and carry out justice in the name of God. As your game goes on, you can add new faction members as you need. Maybe your party takes care of the current villain boss, or they travel to a new locale and meet new members of the faction. Members can just be added organically as you need them. Save yourself the time and pain of filling out a 30-man roster for each faction that may never see the light of day, or worse, they might not even be the right character you need given the emergent storytelling from your sandbox. At this point, you have everything you need to effectively run your faction in your sandbox. If you have everything else under control, I'd say you can come back and develop your factions further, dependent on your available prep time. There's a couple more things you could take a look at. You can define the faction's resources further. What tools do they have at their disposal, and what tools do they lack? Knowing those questions can inform the decisions your faction would make, and perhaps different objectives they would take to either exploit their resources or shore up any deficiencies they might have. Lastly, you can determine leadership. This one's pretty obvious, and you may have already defined it when you've built out your faction membership, but knowing about the faction's leadership can be beneficial. It'll inform you on the actions and goals that leadership finds most pressing and how they will seek to use the faction's resources. Leadership will also influence different conflicts the faction may be involved in. A single leader has a lot more autonomy and less internal conflict than a faction ruled by a council with individuals that may have their own priorities for the faction. Lastly, I just want to share a few different tools and resources that I really like for building out factions. There are a lot of different ones that you can use, but here are a couple that I think are worth checking out to help you get started. The first one is Worlds Without Number. This one by far is my favorite. It has an awesome toolkit that can help you roll up all sorts of different factions. There are even tables in it for internal and external conflicts that you can use to get started out on mapping your faction's relationships. Kevin Crawford has also developed a really cool tag system that creates a great way to start brainstorming on building out your faction. Despite it being quite simple, it can really inform a lot about your faction and what they might want, and just gives you lots of different combinations if you're rolling randomly. It's highly recommended. I think it's awesome. And then lastly, there are also tables for people in the factions and what their source of power or importance is within the faction. That's really great stuff for filling out that small roster of characters and adding more as you need them when you go through your gameplay. Best of all, Worlds Without Number is totally free. You can get the free PDF on DriveThruRPG, or you can buy the deluxe version of the book either physically, or you can buy the deluxe PDF as well. I have the deluxe one, but most of the world building tools and the faction building tools are in the free resource, so you can absolutely just go with that and you'll be totally set. I've included a link in the description, so go ahead and check it out if you haven't heard of Worlds Without Number yet. The second great resource that I like is the Tome of Adventure Design. While this one won't help you build out a faction the way that Worlds Without Number will, it does have some nice tables for patron and villain motivations and plans, all of which can be used for your factions without much stretching of the imagination. So if you're working on the relationship and conflict portions of your factions, these would be good tables to check out and have at your ready. I'll include a link to where you can get the Tome of Adventure Design as well if you want to check that one out. Beyond having those few tables for factions, it has a lot of great other information for developing adventures, developing dungeons, developing unique monsters. Tons of great information in that book beyond just the utility for factions. Factions are an important part of your sandbox. They are your major players that drive the action, conflict, and intrigue within your game world. They can be great patrons, allies, and enemies of your player characters. So they're really worth developing and giving some thought on how they are interacting in your game world and with your player characters. Let me know how many different factions you like to have in your sandbox and how early on you start developing them when you are creating a new campaign or sandbox. If you like this video, please give it a like. It does help the channel out a lot. This video is a part of a greater series on RPG sandbox design, and I also do old school D&D product reviews. So be sure to check those out if they are of any interest to you. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.